We're going to pick up with a second part of Chapter 5 and of Mice and Men. We left off where Lenny and Curly's wife were having an interaction in the barn. Both of them, well, mostly Curly's wife was looking for some sort of validation. Maybe she was looking to have some sort of companionship, and she wanted Lenny to see her, right? She's talking about the potential she had. She's talking about how it's unfair that the men won't talk to her or that they have certain judgments about who she is. And then Lenny gets scared. And he holds on to Curly's wife's hair when she's telling him that she can sort of touch it because she's proud of it, and also it's really soft, and she kind of wants to make him feel good. He holds on, he gets scared, he won't let go, and then he gets angry because he's scared that her screaming will make it so that he loses his dream and his hope in that independence and being able to care for his rabbits. So we left off on this line that said, and then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. So we're going to find out what's going to happen now in the wake of this murder. So he looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. I don't want to hurt you, he said, but George will be mad if you yell. When she didn't answer nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, I've done a bad thing. I've done another bad thing. He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her, just like he did from the puppy. Remember, he just before this killed a puppy on accident, and he wanted to try to hide it the way he's trying to hide Curly's wife. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. I've done a real bad thing, he said. I shouldn't have did that. George will be mad, and he said, and hide in the brush till I come. He's going to be mad in the brush till he came. That's what he said. Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. I'll throw him away, he said. It's bad enough like it is. He put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game. And then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long, with heavy hanging dungs. Halfway to the packing box were the puppies, where she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair arose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple. Her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. So we're going to pause really quickly. One of the ideas we've been talking about overarching ideas, is the idea of mercy killing. Maybe putting something to its end to sort of stop the misery that's would happen if it continued living. We saw that with Candy's dog, and now we're sort of seeing that maybe potentially as one way to look at Curly's wife. Right? So we see this sentence I highlighted, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was living in this perpetual pain and disappointment and state of identity confusion, and desperately trying to find companionship but never being able to actually have it. And so we can potentially, and it's not right that she's murdered, let's not confuse that, but potentially thematically for the literature, look at that this might have been merciful for her, because now in her death, she looks to Steinbeck peaceful, and all of that pain she had in life is gone. So that's something to consider. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From round the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped, and as his body stiffened, he rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her, and "Oh, Jesus Christ." He looked about helplessly, he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ." He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" So this is kind of a moment where you can pause and think about the theme of lost hopes or lost dreams, right? So this fear of what Lenny has done potentially is going to lose George and Candy all of their security and their hope. George was a long time in answering. "Guess we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta get him in, lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor bastard is starved." And he tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. So George knows it's the right thing to do, but he's brokenhearted about it because, they back then they wouldn't really go through like a trial, or they wouldn't sort of give him any sort of benefit of the doubt. And so George is hoping that they would, and that he would maybe just be protected in jail. Maybe he's going to convince himself that protecting him would be the best thing to actually have him arrested, because he couldn't take care of himself any other way. George was doing his best, but really couldn't, keep him out of trouble all the way. So kind of this loss of companionship here. But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that, Curly. Curly gonna want to get him lynched. Curly'll get him killed." Right? Because we remember what type of character Curly has. He's angry, he's spiteful, he wants to prove himself. He might want to get back at Lenny for embarrassing him, so this is kind of his chance. George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last, "that's right. Curly will, and the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke with his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed it from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do it. He used to like to just hear about it so much I got thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George says, I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, or I'll sit in some parlor room till everybody goes home, and I'll come back and work another month and I'll have another $50 more. So George is saying he has to fall into sort of that loneliness, isolation, the solitary life of a guy with no companion at this time, no hope. He's lost his idea of the American dream, and he's sort of lost that huge part of his identity. Candy said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never done it in meanness," he said. "All the time he done bad things, but he never done one of them in mean." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They gotta bring it in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him," he said sharply. "I ain't gonna let 'em hurt Lenny. Now, you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go to the bunkhouse, and in a minute you come out and tell the guys about her, and I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that? So the guys won't think I was in on it? Protect him. So now maybe Candy and George are the companions." Candy said, "Sure, George. Sure, I'll do that." "Okay, give me a couple minutes then, and you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. "You goddamn tramp," he said viciously. "You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you messed things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart." He sniveled and his voice shook. "I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys." He paused and then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. "If they was a circus or a ball game, we would have went to her, just said to hell with work, and went to her, never asked nobody say so, and they'd been a pig and chickens, and in the winter, fat little stove, and the rain coming, and just sitting there." His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went quickly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. He's realized all of the hope in the American dream he's had is completely lost, and he's angry and taking it out on Curly's wife. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Whit and Curly and Crooks keeping back out of the attention range. Candy came after him, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men reached around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom, and they stooped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her and felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. "I know who done it," he cried. "That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it while everybody else was out there playing horseshoes." So let's pause. Slim was the one who went up to her tenderly, lovingly, looked at her with appreciation and sadness, and Curly just approaches it with anger. He's not sad necessarily about his wife. He's more angry at Lenny. So we kind of know this part of Curly's wife's pain is that she was not very loved by her husband. He worked himself into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going to go in for my shotgun. I'll kill that big son of a bitch. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, "I'll get my Luger," and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. "I guess Lenny done it all right," he said. "Her neck's bust. Lenny could have did that." He's really sad for George and for Lenny too. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Maybe he was crying, maybe he was mourning. He's knowing that Lenny's probably going to die too. Slim went on. "Maybe like that time in Weed was you was telling about?" Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. "Well, I guess we got to get him." "Where you think he might have went?" It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We come from north, so he would have went south. I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might, but Curly's gonna want to shoot him. Curly's just still mad about his hand, and suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George. Right? So they're talking about this life that Lenny could live if he is in jail, right? Would that be good for him? Is it good for him to be murdered by Curly, right? So we know that Lenny is not in for a good fate. He's in for misery no matter what. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running in. The bastard stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. That guy has got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot his guts. That'll double him over. All right, so we know Curly's out to shoot him and tells the other guys, you shoot him as well, on sight. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you go in Soledad and get a cop. Get Al Wiltz. He's deputy sheriff now. Let's go. He turned suspiciously on George. You coming with us, fella? Yeah, said George. I'll come, but listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He got Carlson Luger. Course we'll shoot him. George said weakly, maybe Carlson lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife. He said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of the big bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. So Slim kind of brought up the fact that, maybe you should recognize that your wife is dead instead of seeking revenge so quickly. Slim turned to Candy. You stay here and then with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls the horse shifted their feet and rattled their halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. So everyone's sort of in a state of despair now after this. All right, so we're done with chapter 5, and we're going to learn about kind of the fate of all the guys on the ranch now after what has happened. Thank you.